Boa noite. Hoje é 9 de fevereiro de 2026. Meu nome é Breno Altman e estamos dando início a mais um episódio do programa 20 Minutos. Em meio a uma ofensiva político-militar dos Estados Unidos de ampla envergadura, vamos conversar com Vijay Prashad, historiador marxista, jornalista, diretor do Instituto Tricontinental e uma das principais referências intelectuais do Sul Global. A política externa de Donald Trump recolocou a guerra, o sequestro de chefes de Estado e o bloqueio econômico como instrumentos centrais da intervenção norte-americana. O ataque à Venezuela e o rapto de Nicolás Maduro, o cerco brutal contra Cuba, as ameaças permanentes ao Irã e a crescente pressão sobre China e Rússia revelam um império em crise, mas disposto a tudo para preservar sua hegemonia. Nessa entrevista, Vijay Prashad irá analisar os riscos de um cenário internacional tão explosivo. Fiquem conosco, já vamos começar. Good evening, Mr. Prashad. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation once again. You are without microphone.
Why do you need my microphone? It's irrelevant. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks a lot, really.
I'll start with the hottest topic. In your opinion, will Donald Trump attack Iran?
Well, I tell you something quite frankly. On the 2nd of January, when I went to sleep that night, I didn't anticipate at all that the United States would conduct the kind of operation it conducted against Venezuela. By the 4th of January, I was unsure what the United States would do in any country. And I haven't really, now by early February, I haven't really found my feet. I'm still a little shaky on the ground. So you've asked me this question at a delicate moment for me. But I feel like the United States may not actually attack Iran in the same way as it attacked Venezuela. And the reason is, I'm not sure who the target would be. If the United States went into Iran and seized Ayatollah Khamenei, I think that would be that would create immense problems for everybody. Iran would be in a position of extreme turmoil and anger. And I don't know how the remainder of the Iranian government would react to the seizure of Ayatollah Khamenei. So I don't think that's possible. I think, seizing the political leadership of Iran is irrelevant. Like, what's the point of seizing the political leadership? That's not going to make much of a difference. Would they attack Iran's civilian parts of Tehran? I doubt it. They've already done the psychological blow, which they had wanted to do, which was to come in last year and smash Iran's nuclear energy sites, both the research sites and the sites of production. That was an enormous psychological blow to the Iranian government already. So, in the same way as they've already done their psychological blow against Iran and already done a major psychological blow against Venezuela by kidnapping Nicolás Maduro, I'm not sure, if I think about it, what the United States could gain from another attack on Iran. Iran, since the big hit on their nuclear energy sites, has been pretty quiet. They really haven't been able to do much in the Middle East and so on. What we saw within Iran was a protest movement about the very bad fiscal policy pursued by this government. I mean, this government's finance minister was trained in Chicago. He's not the best finance minister for a government interested in helping the people. And so he pushed forward austerity measures, which brought people on the streets. The United States took advantage of it with their own sort of color revolution type activities. The former Shah of Iran's son decided to poke his nose in there. I mean, it was an interesting moment, but I think the United States and the Iranian government realized that this is an isolated incident regarding the very poor economic management by the government. Another attack by the US is not necessarily going to change the balance of forces in favor of the United States. It's already rattled the government. So I don't think they're going to attack Iran again. But as I said, Breno, for somebody to put money on what Donald Trump is doing tomorrow is a very dangerous bet.
In the case of North American attack, what is Iran's defensive or counteroffensive capability?
Yeah, so in fact, it's very interesting. From about 2003, the Iranians developed two forms of defense, which I think were, to their mind, equally important. One was using their linkages with China, Russia, and others. They drew in technological capacity to build a defensive shield around Iran. This included a maritime defense strategy, this included air defense systems, and so on. I mean, I think they have a pretty sophisticated defense system, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Secondly, under the leadership eventually of General Qasem Soleimani, they developed what you might call a long distance defensive strategy. Qasem Soleimani established close relationships or closer relationships with the leadership in Hezbollah in Lebanon. They established relationships with leadership in various parts of the Palestinian armed struggle, with the Yemenis, and so on. The idea of Soleimani's resistance strategy was that if the United States or Israel decides to attack Iran, then these Iranian allied groups would attack Israel or attack US military bases in the Gulf area or attack the Gulf Arab states. That was the sort of bargain that Qasem Soleimani had begun to establish. Well, United States assassinated General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, and then systematically Israel and the United States weakened Hezbollah, overthrew the government in Syria, devastated the Palestinian armed struggle groups, and eventually, I think, boxed in a little bit the Yemenis, although the Yemeni group is the most reliable group right now to conduct an attack. So, in terms of the Iranian two-headed strategy, one internal, one external, the external, let's call it the Qasem Soleimani strategy, has really been weakened considerably. Now, the defend the homeland strategy sounded great, Breno, before January 3rd. Now, we don't even really know exactly what weapons systems the United States has developed with their close to $5 trillion a year. We don't know exactly what they developed. Is it true that they were able to melt the Russian and Chinese systems that the Venezuelans were using? If it's true that they were able, as Donald Trump bragged, to shut down the power grid, to shut down the air radar, to shut down and destroy the air defense systems, then the Iranians are extremely weak. It's interesting, what the United States allowed to remain online was the internet in Venezuela, because they perhaps were expecting, they probably over expected that Maria Corina Machado's US-backed network would send out messages, people would come to the street. In fact, they didn't come to the street, and Trump set Maria Corina Machado aside. So they may leave the internet alive in Iran, but they can shut everything else down, including the communication systems of the government. So Iran, in that sense, must be feeling extremely exposed. So what I'm trying to say is, what is the need for the United States to attack Iran when it is already revealed to the Iranian government that they are very exposed? See, the United States is not interested in invading Iran. They don't want to invade Venezuela. They can no longer invade countries because they don't want to take casualties, and they don't know what to do with the country having invaded it. They had that experience in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but they want to intimidate countries. And if you've already intimidated a country, what's the need of attacking it? Attack is a form of intimidation. And I think Iran is already significantly able to hear the message from Washington.
How do you believe Russia and China would act in the face of a US attack on such an important ally?
Well, you're asking a very important question. Again, I'll keep returning to Venezuela, Breno, because you got to return to Venezuela to understand Iran today. The night before, or rather just several hours before Mr. Maduro or President Maduro had been kidnapped, he met with the highest leadership of the Chinese government regarding Latin America. He met with President Xi Jinping's personal representative on Latin America. He met with two senior officials of the Chinese foreign ministry, the heads of the Latin American desk. They were sleeping in Caracas the night the United States conducted the raid and kidnapped Nicolas Maduro. They had just met with President Maduro. So, in that sense, what can the Chinese do? Like the Chinese, I don't think, maybe they sent a private one. I don't think the Chinese sent a demarche or a complaint to the United States government about the fact that their senior officials were in Caracas when this attack took place. I don't think so. I don't believe that China, can do anything to change the balance of forces in this country. I mean, the pressure on Delcy Rodriguez, the president of Venezuela, is immense. So much so that she publicly has said, I can't take any more orders from Washington. They are basically telling her, Breno, if you don't do this, that, and the other thing, we'll convert Caracas into Gaza. And she's a responsible leader of her people. She cannot afford to take that risk. So she has been negotiating with the Americans. The Chinese and Russians are not coming in to defend Venezuela. But would they tolerate a similar situation in Iran? I don't think so. I think you're right to say such an important ally. Why? For one, Iran is geographically very important for China's Belt and Road project. It's the key for China's Belt and Road project into the Middle East. That's very important. There's enormous Chinese investments in Iran. For the Russians, this would be even more dangerous because if this government falls in Tehran, and if, for instance, although it's unlikely, the Shah of Iran's son is brought back, he'll welcome the United States to set up, anything. Of course, military bases, that's easy. But he would let the United States to bring in mid-level nuclear missiles into Iran. This is completely unacceptable to Mr. Putin's Russia. One of the reasons there's a war going on in Ukraine is around the question of intermediate nuclear missiles, NATO missiles placed in Ukraine. And so I just don't feel like Russia and China would say, you can do this to Iran. I mean, they can't do anything about what the US did in Venezuela. Venezuela is very far for them. They're against it. They've condemned it, but there's little they can do in terms of actually material force. But with Iran, I think if it comes down to it, the Russians may once again try to send aircraft or something. I don't know what the Chinese would do. You can turn around and say, look, Russian aircrafts didn't defend the Assad government from the fall and from the Al-Qaeda takeover, but that's not actually accurate. Russian aircraft came in 2015. For 10 years, they defended that government from a US attack on Syria. They were not capable of putting their planes into the air to fight the Israeli attacks on Syria? That's a question to ask Mr. Putin. Why did Russian aircraft sit on the ground while Israeli aircraft bombed Syrian army positions? That's a question we need to ask Mr. Putin. That's not a question that you and I can ask anybody else. I mean, the Russians had military aircraft in Syria. They didn't defend the government at the end. Why? I don't have the answer to that. So I don't want to. Can't even speculate on why.
You mentioned the lack of objectives in the U.S. attack on Iran. But why such a strong concentration of military forces practically on the Iranian coast? If it were just a threat, couldn't it have been from a distance?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so you are in Brazil. You remember bits and pieces of Operation Brother Sam, okay? I mean, you remember. You mostly read about it. Have been too young to
I was
remember
just 3 years old, but I
Yes,
have read a
been,
lot about it.
You would have been too young to remember it, but people older than you would remember that in the lead up to the coup d'etat against the government of João Goulart in Brazil, United States set in place an armada off the coast between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. It was called Operation Brother Sam. The idea that the United States had with Operation Brother Sam was to squeeze, in a sense, the Brazilian government and to give the military confidence to act. That if the military acted, and by the way, it's I think important for people to recognize that the military coup in Brazil was the opening of a cycle of military coups in South America. It's a new kind of post 1945 military coup. So this was the period when the Soviet Union had links with countries in Latin America, and I think even the Brazilian military was not sure what it would be the consequence of moving against a civilian government. And so Operation Brother Sam gave them a kind of umbrella that, look, we're going to protect you regardless of what happens. I don't think the Americans were ready to bomb Sao Paulo, certainly not Rio. I mean, United States culture was enamored by bossa nova and so on. There would have been an uproar in the US had Rio been touched. But I don't think they really were intending to bomb anybody, Breno. I think they sat there to give the military confidence and to intimidate the civilian government. But then there was a coup. It lasted 21 years. Now, the United States sat off the coast of Venezuela for a very long time before this operation. People say, well, US planes, when they came in and bombed those little boats, were also testing Venezuelan air defense systems. It's possible. It's possible. But it was an intimidation. It certainly did intimidate the government. I mean, once the Gerald Ford, the world's largest carrier, was sitting off the coast of Venezuela, you'd have to be a fool not to know that the US was going to do something. I mean, they effectively brought their killer off the coast and they were going to act. But it's very intimidating for a government. It's what used to be called gunboat diplomacy. You put your gunboat off the coast or in the river, and then people basically are intimidated into saying whatever, giving things up. United States tax between gunboat diplomacy and actually violence, attacking. Again, it's not been very well reported, but during the Israeli genocide in Gaza, United States had a naval armada in the Eastern Mediterranean, immense pressure against all the other states in the region. You can't get involved here. We are providing cover. The British aircrafts coming out of Cyprus, the same. They were flying around the Eastern Mediterranean, effectively saying, this is our airspace. We're not going to permit Russian planes or anybody else, Chinese planes, to enter this airspace. This is our pond, as the British like to say. So they are building up an armada. Is this for an attack on Iran, or is it indeed for more intimidation? Again, it's hard to predict these things, but my feeling is I think they're just putting the pressure up against the government in Iran. Partly, it's important to recognize that if I know it and you know it, Washington knows that in Iran, there are tensions within the ruling establishment. There are great tensions of how to deal with the US. There's a section of the government that wants to compromise even more. There's a section in the Iranian government that says no compromise with the US. It would be a violation of the Iranian revolution. So, they are going to put pressure on that debate and dispute. I don't know what the outcome will be. I mean, they can attack Iran again at any point, but I'm not sure what the targets would be. I don't think it's a kidnapping. They've already hit the nuclear sites pretty hard. I'm not sure Iran has recovered from that. It would be
To
interesting.
kill Khamenei?
Pardon?
Killing Khamenei could be a target?
Yeah, but whether killing him or kidnapping him would create an enormous backlash in Iran. I mean, Iran is an extraordinarily patriotic society. You cannot underestimate the level of patriotism. And Ayatollah Khamenei has been in that seat for a long time. He's an elderly man. He's a beloved man. And I don't know if you noticed it, but in the last few days, he went to visit the shrine of Ayatollah Khomeini, the first Ayatollah of the Islamic Republic. It's very rare to have an Ayatollah visit the shrine of another Ayatollah. It's a message, it's an important message. Well, I asked my friends, what message do you think Khamenei is sending to the Iranian people? One of them could be that, dear Ayatollah Khomeini, I am coming to visit you soon, that my end is nigh. I mean, he's an old man. My end is nigh. I'll die a natural death, or the United States will kill me. This is a precursor to martyrdom. And, in the Shiite tradition, which is the dominant religious tradition in Iran, martyrdom is an extraordinarily important cultural feature because, after all, this is the story of the Battle of Karbala. It's the story of Muharram, one of the main days, the celebratory days or commemoratory days of the Shiite people and so on. Martyrdom is not to be discounted. And I feel like the Ayatollah is going back to his predecessor to say, I'm going to join you as a martyr soon. If the United States wants that blood on its hands, I don't think it's going to be easy for them to get their way in Iran. It will radicalize further.
On one side, the Islamic Republic of Iran criticized it for disrespecting the rights of women and gays, as well as repressing protests. On the other, the United States and Israel eager to overthrow the current Iranian regime. Which side is right in this battle?
Well, let's take the story in reverse. Firstly, the United States is not known for overthrowing a government and bringing in a political authority that respects women and gays. I mean, most recently in Syria, United States and Israelis orchestrated the rise to power of Ahmad al-Sharra, a former Al-Qaeda chief of Syria. Ahmad al-Sharra is not going to celebrate a pride march. He's not going to celebrate feminism. This is not the politics of people the United States backs. United States has just sold out the Syrian Kurds in northern Syria, perhaps one of the more progressive sections of Syrian society, which did celebrate women and sexual minorities and so on. So the United States is not going to be the great defender of women and sexual minorities. They weren't in Afghanistan. They were not in Syria and so on. They in fact sold out the people in Syria who did. So they are not a reliable ally of freedom and liberty and so on. The United States is not reliable at all, nor is Israel. They will bomb to get their way, to control the country, to take its sovereignty away. The thing is that Iran, like every country, has to make its own journey to emancipations of different kinds. When the Iranian Revolution happened, everybody seemed to join it against the Shah, but everybody was not capable of seizing political power. The communists were not capable, the liberals were not capable, and so on. Initially, of course, the most powerful force were the Islamists. And when Ayatollah Khomeini returned from France, he was greeted by millions of people in Tehran. In the initial period, the Ayatollahs decided to utilize the liberals. So Bani Sadr was the prime minister and so on in the early period. And then they found the liberals annoying and sort of set them aside. Okay, Iran has its own process. It has its own history. I don't think you can bomb this government into making Iran a homosexual and feminist free zone. It's not going to happen like that. This is a struggle of the Iranian people. They are going to have to figure out their own cultural limitations and their cultural weaknesses that need to be established. So I really think there's no question of which is the better side, which is the side today that has more of a chance of creating a better Iran. Certainly not Israel and the United States. And it is certainly the process that's there now. I mean, I am not interested personally in living under a theocratic government. Okay, that's my personal view. If I lived in Iran, I would both defend my government and I would fight it at the same time. If the United States decided to attack India today, okay, under the BJP, Mr. Narendra Modi as the government, I would defend the Modi government from attack by the United States, and I would call for a new dispensation in India. I would say we need to fight to create a better government than this. Same in Brazil. I mean, Bolsonaro comes back as the president. United States decides to do another Operation Brother Sam. I think I would see Breno Altman on the streets in Sao Paulo with a megaphone saying, "Down with Yankee imperialism," and then we'll fight Bolsonaro ourselves afterwards.
How would you characterize Donald Trump's foreign policy? Is it simply a continuation of traditional US imperialism, or does it introduce new dynamics?
It's a little of both. I mean, certainly it is a continuation of US imperialism. The overall goals of the foreign policy are unchanged. Obama believed in the sanctity of US imperialism. It was Barack Obama, the liberal, who signed the executive order against Venezuela, which tightened the sanctions and so on. This is a continuation of US imperialism. But there's actually quite a significant difference between the Trump government and almost every government since the 1970s in the United States. If not the 1970s, at least 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, US foreign policy was guided by a kind of idealism. It was an idealistic foreign policy. It believed that the whole world could be made into the United States. And it believed that you could use the instruments of power that the US government had to make the world into the United States. Well, how would you do that? You bomb Iraq and you can create a neoliberal paradise. Or you squeeze a little country like Panama, come and kidnap its president, you can make it like the United States. You can make everywhere a paradise of free markets where the elites, blah, blah, blah. So that was an idealist approach to foreign policy. You can use any form of power. It was Bill Clinton's kind of power. You can, in a way, whether it's a tank or a bank, the tank or the bank is able to create this great America. The world will be America and so on, will be the United States. Well, Mr. Trump comes from a slightly different viewpoint. His main advisors are not foreign policy idealists. They are foreign policy realists. This is there in the US State Department, people he's appointed, but also his close advisors around him. They believe that, yes, the United States can be the most powerful country in the world, but no, you can't bomb a country and make it into the United States, partly because he doesn't believe that the so-called savages can be like the United States, that, these savage countries, these countries like Somalia and Venezuela, whatever, they can't be like the United States. Okay, if the US takes over the waterfront, you can make beautiful Trump hotels and all of that. But the people themselves can't be like the United States. So they need power to essentially define them, to constrain them, to prevent them from migrating to the US, to prevent them from harassing people who come to the hotels in Mogadishu or in Gaza City. They need power. They need to be gated into vast sort of concentration camps for the majority of the world's people. They cannot be allowed to come and disturb the beautiful people on, Donald Trump's friend Jeffrey Epstein's island. They can do whatever they want there. They don't want laws and so on. So Trump has a different view of the world. He doesn't believe you bomb Iraq and make it into a neoliberal paradise. He believes you use US power to make a section of Iraq the paradise of the United States. You should have these people in that section be allowed to take all the wealth from the Iraqis, but you just gate the other Iraqis. Doesn't matter, they don't need to live in democracy and all of those stupid ideas. He doesn't follow all of that. So this is a departure from the post 1991 idealist foreign policy, but not a departure from the imperialist goals. Those are almost identical.
What has changed in the United States strategy toward Latin America?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Good question. In a way, one could argue that by and large, apart from, let's say, the attempted coup against Chavez in 2002, apart from the coup against Honduras in 2009, the coup against Evo Morales, apart from these activities and apart from Steve Bannon's meddling in Brazil and the lawfare and the this and the that, apart from all this, the United States was really quite focused on the Middle East for a better part of the 2000s. And in a sense, the realists around Donald Trump quite correctly said that from their point of view, the United States has to reestablish its hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. So the national security strategy released by Mr. Trump effectively says, from the Arctic Circle to Antarctica, United States owns the whole thing. And so he brings back a very crude reading of the Monroe Doctrine and then has a Trump corollary. The Trump corollary effectively says that the United States can do anything to establish the Monroe Doctrine. And so that is basically the foreign policy. US will use any means, whether it's the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro or it's interfering in this year's Brazilian election. It may not be Steve Bannon, but somebody else will be sent with a suitcase to figure out how to take advantage of opportunities in Brazil. Is a very good chance that the United States will utilize the rise of the new right-wing leaders, Jose Antonio Cast in Chile, of course, Javier Milei in Argentina, of course, Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, Bukele in El Salvador, and then a few others. Perhaps the right will return to power in Colombia and so on. And they are going to back some phenomenally charismatic figure in Brazil, who, whether Lula wins the election next year or this year or not, they're going to create this figure who will be the spokesperson for the parliament, where the Bolsonaristas will be in charge. And this new right wing, what we are calling the angry tide in Latin America, will become promoted by the Trump administration as the voices of reason in Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere. He's going to try to push out Mark Carney in Canada for sure. After he's seized Greenland, which is not impossible, it's not a joke anymore, it's not impossible. After he's tried to destabilize Mexico, not impossible. After he's tried to get rid of Mark Carney, not impossible. He's going to establish the Western Hemisphere as the base area of the right wing. I mean, this is the reverse Che Guevara strategy. Che Guevara's FOCO strategy in Bolivia was to spread the revolution around Latin America and the Caribbean in the Western Hemisphere. Well, Trump is doing the reverse Che Guevara.
Spreading counter-revolution.
Absolutely.
In the case of Venezuela, what would be Donald Trump's target in kidnapping President Nicolás Maduro and maintaining similarly friendly relations with interim President Delcy Rodriguez?
I mean, I think they needed to do something from the United States perspective. It was clear that by the middle of last year, things were not going anywhere. They were not going to repeat. This government of Mr. Trump was not going to repeat the Guaido strategy. It was clear after the parliamentary elections that with Henry Capriles as the leader of the opposition in the Venezuelan parliament, the United States doesn't have an ally. I mean, I've interviewed Henry Capriles. He ran against Nicolas Maduro in 2014. The victory margin was 51% to Maduro, 49% to Henry Capriles. Henry Capriles is an opposition man. He's from the right. He was the governor of Miranda. But Henry Capriles was not interested in riding to power on the back of an F-16. This is not his strategy. Okay, we can disagree with Henry Capriles a lot, but I think one can say quite confidently that Mr. Capriles is not interested in being a tool of the United States government. He's a man of the right, but he's not that kind of guy. Maria Corina Machado cannot win a national election in Venezuela. It's just not possible. And it was, I got to say that in the last presidential election, you and I were in Caracas. I think that her proxy did pretty well. I think he got in the mid 40s. But it's very difficult for an opposition political candidate to prevail against a Chavista when the Chavista base remains so firmly clear that whatever problems they have with the government, it's much worse with the opposition. The opposition will roll back all the gains that they've been able to make, that they would like a better situation. Very rarely do you meet a Chavista person who's going to tell you everything's great in Venezuela. It's not great. I mean, the sanctions are eating into their very being. And in the worst period, it was terrible. So the Trump administration needed to do something. They needed to unblock the situation. Well, one thing they could have done was a direct attack on downtown Venezuela. They could have just bombed a bunch of streets, obliterated a bunch of historical buildings and so on, and put the threat directly to President Nicolas Maduro that we could do more. But I think when they had the opportunity to kidnap the president of the country in a relatively clean kidnap attempt, and then tell the vice president that, look, we're going to give you 15 minutes or 20 minutes or half an hour. It doesn't matter. We'll give you 24 hours. It doesn't matter. If you don't comply with the following 10 things, we're going to obliterate downtown Caracas. Take a look at Gaza. Look at what we, through our proxies, the Israelis did in Gaza. We can do that. You want us to start in a smaller town? You want us to start in Barquisimeto, in Maracaibo? We can do a demonstration. Remember, the United States will say, we dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan. We're not worried about this. Yeah, we can obliterate the whole of Barquisimeto. Forget Caracas. We'll leave it intact for now. Would you like us to do that? Because we can. And we'll show you, we'll wipe out, 2 million Venezuelan people in an evening. And then you're going to agree to the same terms. And I think Delcy Rodriguez then says, look, I'm not going to participate in the mass killing of my own people. I'm going to say, okay, we'll agree to these things. I can't agree to all of it. And Trump says, okay, let's talk. Now, is she giving in to the United States? I would say, Breno, that that's a very unfair thing if I said that. That's not the implication at all of what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is that the choices with the kind of kidnapping the United States government did, the choices before any government in Venezuela are extremely narrow. I mean, what they are effectively being told, what Trump effectively told them is, I don't think Maria Corina Machado can do this. She's not up to the task. If I overthrow you guys and put her in there, it'll be a disaster. She's not going to be able to, you command a section of the population. In fact, by Trump agreeing to this, the United States is now actually admitting that it's likely Mr. Maduro won the last election. You know, this is very interesting, that the fact that they are saying to this government, you can stay on, is an admission that they were lying from the last election onward, that the election was stolen. I think they know that Maduro, by a slim margin, won the election. He won the first time 51 to 49%. You won by a slim margin, but Maria Corina Machado did not win. And I don't think she can do what we are asking you to do. What we are asking you to do is you restart the oil. And Delcy Rodriguez, Diosdado Caballo, all of them look at each other and say, hey, listen, wait a minute. We always wanted to sell the oil. We don't care who we sell it to. We want to sell the oil. The Yanks are saying sell the oil. Okay, we'll sell the oil. But then they said, these are the other things you can't do. You can't do this with the Cubans, that with the Cubans. Very interesting. End of the day, what the United States is trying to do is to break the alliance between Venezuela and Cuba, because they want to finally overthrow the Cuban Revolution. That's the pressure they are putting on Claudia Sheinbaum, president of Mexico, to cut oil supplies to Cuba. And that's the reason why the Cuban government has declared a state of war. I think that's more interesting to them. Now, it will be seen whether Delcy Rodriguez and the remainder of the leadership in Venezuela are willing to break with the Cubans to preserve and prevent another bombing run by the United States. I don't know. I am not sure. The United States, Mr. Trump said openly, we won't have to bomb another night. He said that openly. We won't have to bomb. It's a signal. He's saying that, look, we can do it. We're not going to do it. Then he said, we are not going to bomb another night, but we could do it later.
Of course. Several analysts speak of a betrayal against Maduro and even an internal coup within Chavismo, in agreement with the White House. How do you respond to this hypothesis?
Well, I mean, people may know better than me. Maybe they have a hotline to somebody who told them something classified. I don't know. I was surprised when Tariq Ali said, I spoke to people in Caracas and this is a betrayal. I don't agree with him at all. I don't agree with people who take this line of opinion. And again, I don't have all the facts. I have the facts I have. So here's what I believe. It's interesting. First, right after Mr. Maduro and Celia Flores were kidnapped, Delcy Rodriguez held a press conference of a kind. There were cameras and so on. Right next to her was sitting Diosdado. Now, Diosdado is an interesting person. There are 6 people named in the US government bizarre indictment against Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela. One of the 6 people is Diosdado. He is named in that indictment. If this was a betrayal, why would Delcy Rodriguez be sitting with Diosdado? Diosdado also happens to be perhaps the most beloved Chavista leader. Why would she be with him? Why would he have decided to be part of this? Why didn't he go out and say that, no, I resigned. This is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. I think they know what happened. What happened was the United States used some pretty fierce technology to break through their defenses. Yes, it is probably true that at a very low level, the US government had a lot of intelligence coming from somebody in a security detail, maybe somebody in the military and so on. I mean, no military or security detail is immune from being infiltrated by your enemy. Nobody. I mean, they had the detailed blueprints of where Nicolas Maduro was staying the night. They built a copy of it in the United States and practiced on it. They had obviously people, informing them. They had lots of people on the ground tracking Nicolas Maduro and so on. But I don't think it was Delcy Rodriguez or her brother Jorge Rodriguez or Diosdoro Caballo or Vladimir Padino. I don't think these people were involved. And the reason I don't think, and here, you can tell me I'm being naive, but these people are true believers. I mean, the Rodriguezes, I don't think they were going to sell out their comrade Nicolas Maduro to people who killed their father. I'm a sentimental person, and I have these thoughts in my head. Again, you could say, well, you're just naive, and perhaps that is so. And I take my naivete any day rather than distrusting people that I know and have known for a long time. I know these people. I don't think they betrayed their friend and comrade. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. A gun may have been put to the head, but I don't think it happened. I think this was a snatch and grab. United States is very capable of it. And I think they put pressure on the government and said, if you don't give in to these demands, we're going to get you. And not just you, but the people in your country. And I think they had no choice. They had to give up Nicolas Maduro Moros, Celia Flores. And as soon as they gave them up, the United States effectively began to back down from the claims they were making against Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. I don't know what kind of trial they'll have in New York. There's a 92-year-old judge presiding over the trial. They've already withdrawn the allegation that Nicolas Maduro is the head of the Cartel de los Sols, because as we've all written about before, there is no such thing as a Cartel de los Sols. They've already withdrawn that. To accuse Nicolas Maduro of having guns is ridiculous. He lives in a foreign jurisdiction. He can do whatever is permitted in the jurisdiction where he lives. He doesn't live in the United States. He lives in Venezuela. You can't charge him with weapons possession. That's ridiculous. The charge sheet against Maduro is laughable. So let's see what happens in that case. But I must say, I don't think they were given much choice. For instance, when Lula was arrested, why didn't the leadership of the PT court arrest? Why didn't they say, if you are arresting, our comrade President Lula, we are all coming to jail. We're all going to march to the government house and refuse to sit down till you arrest us and throw us in. Why didn't they do that? Why don't we do these things to defend people with whom we are struggling? Well, because we are trying to build a political process at the same time. And so the MST and others stood outside. I spent the night in Curitiba. Bon dia, Lula, and so on. Yelled a speech out to Lula so he could listen to our voices and say, okay, they are there. We were fighting to get you out, Lula libre, and so on. I mean, you don't all say arrest us all or kill us all. We don't want the process to die. We are strategic. There are retreats and then there are advances.
Do you believe the United States could resort to military force against Cuba?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I have a feeling that they don't want to resort to military force until perhaps a very late stage in the fraying of the government. Once again, with Cuba, just as with Venezuela, perhaps an occasional bombardment here and there might happen, but I don't think there'll be an invasion. I don't think so, because I think they also recognize that in Cuba, a very large part of the population is motivated to defend the Cuban Revolution. And they would have to go street by street. There'd be a lot of casualties on all sides. It'd be very hard in Cuba to determine who's a civilian and who's a military, because everybody is going to be fighting. And I think the United States doesn't want that. Will they bomb Havana? I think they realize with Havana, with Caracas, with Tehran, that people are patriotic in these countries. If you come in and destroy a national symbol, the National Library or something, it'll really motivate people to fight you. They'll be angry. So I don't know if there's the appetite in Washington to bomb Cuba. I just don't feel like there's a major appetite for it. I think they know that, Cuba doesn't quite have the massive military that could be bombed. In other words, Cuba has an armed personnel who could deal with street to street fighting. But Cuba doesn't have like a huge tank brigade that you can bomb all the tanks, or you can bomb the airfields and so on. Doesn't really have that. I mean, what are the targets that you would choose? The sanctions have made a toll on the Cuban military as well, but not on Cuban morale. They can't get that. So I'm not sure the US will actually try that. Also, I think you'd get a much more sympathetic reaction from the world if the US bombs Cuba. The US has done a very good job, in a sense, defaming the reputation of Nicolas Maduro. But the Cuban Revolution is at a different place, Breno. I think that lots of people, liberals included, would be horrified by an attack on Cuba.
But is Cuba able to survive to the pressure United States is putting on right now?
Well, I fear not. I mean, I fear that if Mexican oil supplies don't come in, I fear that if the Chinese don't significantly improve their supplies that they've been sending, they did increase them, but they need to significantly increase them. I think the Russians need to increase their support for Cuba. I mean, I think Latin American countries need to consider sending vessels of support to Cuba with a great deal of fuel and food and so on. I would like to see Canada send supplies to the Cuban Revolution. I mean, it would be a very interesting gesture for Mark Carney at this point, coming in at Davos and making the speech that he did make about the world changing and a rupture in the world, not just a change, but a rupture. Well, put your money where the rupture is and come and support, non-aligned Cuba against the United States cruel pressure campaign against the island. That would be interesting to me. I would like to see the Kingdom of Denmark send a vessel of support to the people of Cuba. These are all ideas that bounce around in my head, and I want to get it somehow to the people of Denmark or the people of Canada, maybe even the Greenlanders, 56,000 of them. Send, maybe some fish, a contingent of frozen fish to the Cuban people in solidarity.
Mr. Prashad, how could the United States be stopped if there is a clear military superiority over its adversaries, including China and Russia?
I mean, there are two ways that the United States can be stopped at this point. United States can't be stopped by military intimidation. Not right now. I mean, you don't spend 75% of the world military budget as the NATO plus countries have been spending. You don't do that and then have people be scared of you militarily. It's absurd. Our institute published a text 2 years ago called Hyper Imperialism. You and I have talked about it. In that text, we emphasized the military aspect. We felt that progressives and the left around the world are neglecting US military power when they keep talking about the decline. You can't neglect US military and information power. You can't just say, well, the Chinese GDP is rising. That's not sufficient. Yeah. Can't just say, well, there's now a BRICS bank. Great. But there's no BRICS military. There's no BRICS intermediate missile that can deliver a BRICS nuclear weapon. I mean, it just doesn't exist. Most BRICS countries like Brazil gave up their nuclear program. They don't have a real defense against the United States. Brazilian military, well and good, but what can they do if the US fires off from the Gerald Ford, intermediate missiles into their military bases? Can they actually defend them? I don't think so. So that is off the table in the short term, but there are immediate things that are important. Number one, the people within the United States. There have been these growing movements around from Minnesota outward, the general strike and so on. The election in New York City is a promising note. A young man gets elected on a very progressive slate. We're seeing the development of more and more of a political aspect within the United States that's challenging the status quo, not just Trump. They're challenging the status quo. we need to see much more of that. I mean, within the United States, the balance of forces needs to change. You can't expect it to come from abroad. But secondly, from abroad, there has to be a more forthright, call it a coalition of sense, coalition of rationality. I mean, it's not enough for Mark Carney and others to go to Davos and make these speeches. They are going to have to go to the G20 meetings and so on and try to isolate the United States politically. It's time to isolate the United States politically. They can't be polite to Washington. You see, the Europeans are trapped somewhere between the Ukraine conflict and the disrespect they feel from Trump. Why should Emmanuel Macron, with those ridiculous dark glasses on, continue to genuflect, as if every time he sees Trump, he has to bow down before him and read, a Hail Mary or something. I mean, why are they so intimidated? They need to start isolating. If they really feel that Europe is getting discarded by the United States, well, then take the discard on your shoulder and tell the United States they are isolated. I mean, these are the only two things I can think of. Increasing global South isolation of the United States diplomatically and politically, joined perhaps by one or two European allies, and then to see the change within the United States with more and more political activity saying, no, not in my name. It's not going to happen in my name. And these two things might put some pressure on Washington. But, I don't think anybody can actually militarily get the US to back down.
Could the midterm elections in November put the Trump administration on the ropes?
Midterms are often bad for the president, for the incumbent, often, but you'd have to change a lot to have the Democrats prevail in the midterms. And secondly, even if the Democrats do well in the midterms, I think they would be interested in slightly less aggressive ICE and so on. But I'm not sure they are a real opposition to US imperialism. I think when it comes to Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, the Democrats are perfectly happy with what Trump is doing. I didn't see much Democratic opposition to what Trump did in Venezuela. They said things like, we shouldn't have done it that way, but we're glad Maduro is gone. That's not an opposition. They are going to say, we don't like Trump's methods, but we're glad, X has happened, Y has happened. That's not an opposition. That's not sufficient. We need something more. But I do feel, and I think you're right to raise the question, I do feel that enough of a loss in the midterms would, make people think, and perhaps would give the new elected people to Congress a sense that they have to represent the people on the streets. I think that could be interesting. But I'm not overly confident that the opposition to Trump in Congress is going to be the kind of pressure needed. I think the mass street demonstrations, although they don't have an immediate impact on the United States, I think they are building the confidence of a new generation of people that are looking both at the electoral alternatives, New York City, and at the same time as the importance of their ground activity, their protests and so on. Let's see where this goes, Breno. But certainly the midterm is important, but I don't think it's overwhelmingly important.
Could the new documents in the Epstein case shake the Trump administration?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think that, again, Trump is, remember that before he was, I think, re-elected, between his presidencies, Trump said, I'm so popular, even if I went down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and shot somebody to death with lots of witnesses, I wouldn't go to jail. I mean, remember that Mr. Trump famously, very famously, was caught on tape talking horrendously about women, just vicious language. I mean, this is not going to hurt him altogether. And in a way, lucky for Mr. Trump, there is already a paper trail of him telling Epstein to screw himself, to get out of it. I mean, they had a falling out. So I think Trump may come out of this not better. Nobody comes out of this well, but slightly less worse than a number of people, including lots of prominent Democrats, Bill Clinton included, will come out of this very badly. The British royal family, Prince Andrew, former Prince Andrew, will come out of this really badly. I think Trump will survive the Epstein files. I don't think he's going to, unless there is something in the massive trove that has not been released yet. If there is something like that, I doubt that the Republicans will allow it to come out, at least not before the midterm elections.
Two important Chinese generals, Zhang Youxia and Liu Zhengli, have been dismissed by President Xi Jinping and are being investigated on corruption charges. Could this change represent a shift in Beijing's military strategy, especially regarding Taiwan?
Well, firstly, some of this is a little opaque. Why this happened, for what exact reason it happened. The timing is interesting and also strange. Very clearly, this strengthens the hand of President Xi Jinping. No doubt about that. I don't accept what the Western press says, where it says, well, he's more authoritarian now and so on. This basically strengthens the left flank of the Communist Party of China. Mr. Xi Jinping is the leader of that flank. This flank will be considerably strengthened as a consequence of this. Xi Jinping effectively is running the military commission. So that's that. I think Xi Jinping is extremely cautious regarding Taiwan. I mean, having seen what happened in Venezuela and so on, I don't think they're in the mood for a direct confrontation with the United States. I just don't think so. But I think this particular change of office has more to do with strengthening the left inside the country than Taiwan. And it's certainly, I think, coincidental that this happened shortly after Donald Trump announced at Davos that, listen, the Russians and Chinese better learn about their air defense systems because they just collapsed against us. It's a very interesting remark that Donald Trump made. Was this related? I don't know, because, we're not going to find out. Maybe there'll be later some story, but we're not going to find out immediately.
Which global scenario do you consider most likely for the near future? Are we close to a third world war?
We're already in one. We're already in one, Breno. I mean, there's a war going on in Sudan. The genocide is unending in Gaza. We've been through cycles of war in the Great Lakes area of Africa. This kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the state of war against Cuba. I mean, this war, the Third World War, is happening in ways that are different from earlier wars, but no less disturbing and no less damaging. Once again, the far right is in control of war making. Yeah, once again, the far right is deeply in control. I mean, look at the confidence this is giving to far right leaders around the world. Imagine the seizing of Nicolas Maduro, what message this sends to Jose Antonio Cast in Chile when he comes into office. It basically says you can do anything from a right-wing standpoint. He went immediately to meet Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. What message is this sending to Javier Milei? They can do anything. They'll get away with it. You want to destroy Gaza, you can do it. You can get away with it. No problem. Sanctified. You want to use massive force against X, Y, Z, you can get away with it. Milei of Argentina has just decided to give away a military base in the Antarctic South to the United States. Their ships came in and docked there. You can just give it away. Nothing. You don't need to go to the assembly. You don't need to discuss it with anybody. First, you transfer it from a provincial authority to the central government, and then you tell the Americans they can come in. This is the war. It's already on.
I have finished my questions, and now it's time for our game, our final game. I want to know who you choose as the greatest revolutionary since the 18th century in a head-to-head comparison of the most prominent names. Are you ready?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
this is not a game for me. This is who's on my wall. Yeah.
Subcomandante Marcos, leader of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or Hugo Chavez, president of Venezuela?
Really, Breno? Really? You're really asking me that question? My leader in my lifetime, Hugo Chavez, and before Hugo Chavez, Thomas Sankara. Forget it. That's not even a
My next
question.
question is Hugo Chavez or Thomas Sankara, president of Burkina Faso?
Not a question, because Thomas Sankara and Hugo Chavez, if we were people who believed in mysticism, I would say they are the same person.
You have to choose one to the next
Okay,
round.
so in which case I choose Thomas Sankara only chronologically because he came before Hugo Chavez.
Thomas Sankara or Samora Machel, commander of the Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo, and first president of independent Mozambique?
All right, interesting. I only choose Thomas Sankara because he was my childhood hero and he was alive and acting in Burkina Faso while I was a college student, and I really admired him. So Sankara.
Sankara or Che Guevara, Marxista guerrilla leader and internationalist revolutionary?
Very interesting. If you asked a Latin American, they would immediately choose Che Guevara without a blink of an eye. But I'm going to stay with Thomas Sankara.
Thomas Sankara or Fidel Castro, leader of the Cuban Revolution?
Wow. Here I return to Cuba because there really hasn't been a bigger influence on my own life, on my personal life and journey. No bigger influence than Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro or Patrice Lumumba, first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Without a doubt, I would stay with Fidel Castro, the great lion of Cuba.
Fidel Castro or Amilcar Cabral, leader of the African Party of the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde?
I'm afraid I might be with Fidel Castro all the way to the end, but let's see.
Fidel Castro or Agostinho Neto, leader of the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola?
I mean, Augusto Neto was amazing because not only was he a revolutionary, he's also a poet, but I stay with Castro.
Fidel Castro or Nelson Mandela?
Castro.
Fidel Castro or Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of
Castro.
Egypt?
Gamal Abdel Nasser was, again, an extraordinary person. I admire him. I celebrate his memory, but Castro.
Fidel Castro or Kim Il-sung, the founder and first leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea?
Kim Il-sung, also a great revolutionary fighter, fought off the Americans, etc., but I can't leave Castro.
Fidel Castro or Kwame Nkrumah, leader of Ghana's independence?
Okay, so I've edited books also in Portuguese, the collected book of Nkrumah and the collected book of Castro. I love Kwame Nkrumah, friendly with his entire family, adore him, but I'm staying with Castro.
Fidel Castro or Salvador Allende?
I'm sitting and talking to you from Santiago, Chile. Down the road from me is the palace where he died. He was a great, great man, but his mentor in some ways was Fidel Castro. So I'm staying with Castro.
Fidel Castro or Deng Xiaoping?
Deng Xiaoping built something incredible, which is that he took the risk of abandoning a certain path for socialism and said, if we don't build the productive forces, socialism will die. For me, Deng Xiaoping is absolutely fundamentally important. The courage of a revolutionary to make those choices. Fidel Castro is extraordinary. I had tremendous personal meetings with him. I love him, but here I'm going to depart and go with Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong?
Without a doubt, Mao Zedong.
Mao Zedong or Ho Chi Minh?
Without a doubt, Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh or Mustafa Kemal Atatürk?
Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh or Emiliano Zapata?
Definitely Ho Chi Minh, because Emiliano Zapata was a character, but Ho Chi Minh was the best, most interesting life.
Ho Chi Minh or Joseph Stalin?
Tough one, Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh or Leon Trotsky?
Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh or Rosa Luxemburg?
Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh or Vladimir Lenin?
I knew this was coming. This is the Marushka doll strategy. And you ended up with a giant. This is an unfair game. Of course, Lenin.
Lenin or Sun Yat-sen?
Lenin.
Lenin or Simon Bolivar?
Lenin. End the game now, Breno.
Lenin or Maximilien Robespierre?
Lenin.
Lenin or Toussaint Louverture?
Lenin.
Mr. Prashad, I wanted to thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for your time.
You knew where this game was going to end, Breno. You knew it, okay? Even if you had said last question, Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin, I would have picked Lenin.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Também agradeço a todas e todos que assistiram a esse programa, em especial aquelas e aqueles que puderam fazer contribuições financeiras ao nosso site e ao canal de Ópera Mundi no YouTube. Sem vocês, nosso trabalho não seria possível e não faria sentido. Um grande abraço a todas e a todos.